I'm happy to talk about regen if you know. I know you said you don't want to, but
I could tell that you did give up vegetarianism under some duress, basically.
And the problem with ultra-processed foods is that they're triggering different reward centers of the brain.
Well, the ultra-processed food thing is triggering for me because that is a pet topic of mine. Okay, Glen Burrows, thanks so much for agreeing to talk to me. We are both going to give a brief introduction, as we agreed, to ourselves. We'll each take 30 seconds, and then I'll say a little bit about how we got here. But for those who are watching who don't know who I am, I'm Chris Bryant. I am a social scientist. I run a company called Bryant Research. I'm a vegan, and I am arguing the position of meat reduction kind of broadly here, although we're going to see where the conversation goes. Glen, if you want to say a brief intro as well.
Yeah, so my name is Glen Burrows. I was co-founder of a business called The Ethical Butcher, which I started from the ground up and I exited about 2 years ago. I am a creative by trade. I am a creative director, photographer, filmmaker, and copywriter. And I primarily work within the regenerative agriculture space now. And I'm currently working for an ag tech startup called New Foundation Farms. My background is I did a degree in food science and nutrition and followed a different career path as a commercial photographer for many years. And I guess the rest of the story will unfold.
Okay, nice. Thanks for the intro, and I'll just say a brief bit about how we got here, and if you want to add anything or amend anything, you can do that as well. So this started in the comments section on LinkedIn, as all good exchanges do. Yeah, indeed. And I was commenting on an AHDB report, which was broadly talking about anemia and about some of the purported environmental benefits of agroecology. And basically I was saying a lot of this is missing the point and we still need to reduce meat consumption a lot. Got a little heated in the back and forth there. We've got videos on the channel about that. Yes, although none of the authors of the report were down for talking with me, Glen was, and I actually really do appreciate that, Glen. So let me start off with that olive branch. I've been trying to talk to someone on what some would say is the other side for some time to talk about these issues, and I have to say none of the scientists who I've tried to engage with have really wanted to engage. So I really do actually appreciate you having the conversation, basically, because there's a lot of people who won't do that.
Thank you. It is interesting, isn't it? We do refer to things as sides, but I think at the end of the day, we actually have the same aim, but just maybe slightly different ideas about how to achieve that aim.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I have spent a little bit of time engaging with, I was going to say your content, like that's very like YouTuber language, but podcasts that you've been on and stuff like that, right? And I think that we probably are closer on a lot of the key issues than the exchange might have had either of us believing at the time, and certainly have had onlookers believing. I think the main things that I wanted to start out with was the actual content of the exchange itself, which I guess that there's... Yeah, I guess that there was kind of like we get into kind of arguing one side or the other. Broadly, I was saying that overall UK meat consumption going down would be a good thing for UK health and environmental outcomes overall. And I was looking for someone from AHDB to defend against that claim. And although we appear to be on other sides of that argument, I think that actually, Glen, you are in agreement that meat consumption going down overall would be a good thing.
I am, because the way we produce it is not conducive to human or environmental health.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So we're in agreement on the point about overall meat consumption going down. And then there was kind of like another subsidiary point, which this was a really dumb point. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the thing about if 64% are obese or overweight, then it's a reasonable assumption that they're consuming 80% of the meat. It's a little bit of speculation on my part, but certainly they're consuming, more than 64% of the calories, let's say, right?
Yeah, I mean, calories in, calories out is down to activity levels play a part in that, and people who are struggling with their weight tend to be less active, therefore perhaps could gain weight on a diet that somebody else might not do according to activity levels. So it's hard to kind of throw too many generalizations, but I know the point you're making is that if someone's overeating and meat is part of that, then they should their overall calorie intake, and meat could be a part of that calorie intake. I think that's the point you were getting towards. And it's not something I disagree with, although I think if somebody's trying to lose weight, increasing their protein is a good way of doing that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and like I say, I don't want to burn too much of our time on this because we have limited time to talk as well. But so I hear what you're saying about calories in, calories out, and it's partly activity as well. My understanding is that it really is a lot more to do with calories in than calories out. Like, existing takes calories, you know what I mean? You burn sort of 500 calories in your sleep or whatever. I mean,
Sure.
Don't quote me on that number, but
yeah, your BMR. Yeah.
Exactly right. Yes, you're burning calories just kind of by existing, and so the calories in, particularly in people who are obese, right? I mean, there's only so much of lack of exercise that you can do. I mean, I don't do very much. I spend about 15 hours a day in front of my computer, right? So, but without having and by the way, I also eat quite poorly. I eat a vegan diet, but I'll smash like a cake in a day, like, a vegan cake. You know, so I'm not a especially healthy guy, but yeah. So okay, so the other point that you said was about protein for weight loss. I think that yes, there is some evidence to show that basically having a higher protein intake, because it increases your satiation and makes you feel more full, right? So you'll want to consume fewer calories. I think there are certainly going to be forms of protein which are more or less prone towards that, and if you do have some protein which is bound up in something quite calorific and quite quite a lot of saturated fat and so on.
Like a ton of saturated fat, sure. And as I'm sure you know, is protein calorie for calorie isn't absorbed in the same way that sugar is calorie for calorie, for example. So you've got proteins, fats, and carbohydrates are 3 macronutrients. And now it's been a long time since I've looked this up, but I do believe that carbohydrates and protein technically in a calorimeter score the same in terms of how many calories per gram. But the difference is your body uses calories to extract the calories from protein, whereas it doesn't with carbohydrates. So there is a thermogenic effect of eating protein that reduces the caloric content by, I believe it's like 22-25% or something like that. So 100 calories of protein, if it's pure protein, like you said, not with saturated fat, not with anything else, you're actually, because you're burning 22-25 to use it, the equivalence is lower. So the calories in, calories out doesn't always relate, as you well said. It's a gross generalization, but when you get into the nuance of it, it's simply not true either. Because of you mentioned the word before, satiety. Satiety, the greatest satiety comes from fiber and protein.
Right. And so, I mean, if there are methods to get an adequate level of protein without having the saturated fats, is that preferable from a health perspective in your view?
I don't think. Well, getting into the sort of fat content of foods, the whole saturated fat, healthy or unhealthy, is a very big and difficult topic with a lot of kind of conflicting information. There is an awful lot of evidence to say that excessive levels of saturated fat are deleterious to human health. They raise LDL cholesterol. There's a link between LDL cholesterol and heart disease. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of epidemiology that's gone into making these connections. But I think general, And I believe a lot of it also comes down to inflammation. Like there are people who have diets high in saturated fat, very low in inflammation, and they seem to do quite well for a very long time. There are people who have high inflammatory diets who are eating small amounts of saturated fat who seem to suffer from all kinds of health-related problems. So I don't feel well enough qualified to sort of comment on the one thing I do know is that your fat ratios, the ideal fat ratio is 1 to 1 to 1, 3 to 6 to 9 of the omegas. Generally, most people consume too much omega-6, not enough omega-3. Omega-3 is primarily found in animal foods. We have plant-based versions of it, such as in flaxseed, but they do need to be converted by the body into true omega-3s. DHA and
ALA.
Yeah, the conversion comes from ALA, but it's a relatively inefficient metabolic process. So a lot of it is lost, and generally we get enough. But I think there's a lot of evidence suggests that diets that are too high in omega-6 are not good for us, and that sort of segues perhaps neatly into the reason why factory farmed animals are more unhealthy for us is they do tend to contain high levels of omega-6 versus omega-3 fatty acids.
Interesting. Okay, that's I think I'd like it if we spend lots of the conversation like lingering on our points of agreement, like that last one there. On the thing about cholesterol and inflammation, there are treatments that will lower LDL cholesterol without impacting on inflammation that will nevertheless reduce the risk of CVD, even when there's low inflammation occurring. So it seems likely that it is LDL cholesterol rather than inflammation that is the driver of disease. To cardiovascular disease. So it's you can lower the LDL cholesterol and without affecting inflammation. It will and it will lower the risk of the disease. So certainly that doesn't show that inflammation is having no effect, but it does show that the cholesterol is having an effect.
Yeah, it's interesting is people. I mean, one thing I learned through my time at Ethical Butcher is that even within a cow, for example, if you take a kind of a standard steak and it will have a cap of fat on it, and then there is like the intramuscular fat. The cap of fat can be quite high in saturated fat, but the intramuscular fat, the fat that's actually what they call the marbling, which butchers look for, is very high omega-3 and lower in saturated fat. So I think a lot of people used to certainly discard that subcutaneous fat and happily consume the intramuscular fat because they do have a very different. When the animal has been pasture fed rather than grain fed, the intramuscular fat is very good fat, very healthy fat for us. But again, its method of production is so important. And if you don't mind, I was in Portugal towards the end of last year. I visited a farm using what's called the Montado system, which is an agroforestry system growing cork oaks, acorns, and keeping animals on pasture underneath the trees. And the farmer there was using a particular native breed of pig, which lives on the acorns that fall off the trees. It's a completely self-contained system. He was producing beef, lamb, goats, and sheep, and pork, like 4 animals for the ecosystem benefits. And he'd had some of the pork tested and found that the levels of oleic acid in the pork were higher than extra virgin olive oil. So he was getting readings of 58% oleic acid in the pork fat versus the best extra virgin olive oil is about 54%. So he was able to categorically say that consuming fat from these pigs could lower human LDL, and he was quite adamant about that. And that I'd never heard a claim that bold, but I think that just sort of leads me down to the most important factor here being method of production. These pigs were not being fed Brazilian soy. They were not being fed used milling grains. They were eating off the land that they're a native breed to be in that country from, in a system that's been operated for 1,000 years. So yeah, I hate categorical black and white answers to questions when there's so much kind of more fine tuning in the methodology.
Yeah, and I think that sort of strategically looking at this conversation, I was looking at some of the regenerative stuff, and I was looking at some of the people on my side and what we have to say about regenerative compared to you lot over there, right?
No, yeah,
getting into these. Well, just to flag that sort of nature of it. But then I thought, what is the goal here? And I had, I've made some sort of notes about well, the animals live longer and therefore there could be a higher carbon footprint per amount of meat and it takes more land and all this other stuff. But what is the purpose of my highlighting that in terms of what then happens in the real world, in supply chains, when people are making decisions about whether they're going to go for the regenerative one or not? Why do I want to use my limited time talking to you attacking regenerative when we both agree that it is vastly preferable to conventional farming, i.e. factory farming?
Yeah.
So I'd written down a bunch of stuff to sort of say about regenerative, and veganism would still be better than regenerative, but I think that pragmatically it's not really it doesn't if you and I were to fight very intensively about this, the people rubbing their hands together would be Cranswick, right, and the rest of the factory farming companies, because maybe I'll bleep out their name there so I don't get sued, but we are in strong agreement that, and I think that we get there by slightly different reasoning, these agroecological systems are far preferable to factory farms.
Yeah, 100%.
And therefore I think there's a sort of constructive agreements that we can base around that. And my main beef, if we can put it that way, with the whole agroecological thing is when and I'm sure that you see this all the time from your position, it is appropriated by sort of interests who want to promote meat consumption in general and not talk about meat reduction, and use it as sort of a smokescreen to say meat consumption is kind of fine per se, which is you must see that sort of thing all the time.
I know where you're trying to get to, and I'm with you. I agree, and the one thing that I kind of, in some ways, when I was working the Ethical Butcher, I was quite new to this world, having not been I was a commercial photographer for 25 years. I was shooting magazine covers and catalogs and advertising for sports brands and things like that. I came into the kind of regen world because I had a massive change in my personal diet, as I think you highlighted in the sort of previews to our conversation here. I did a degree in food science. The first year of my degree, the BSE crisis broke. This was, I'm going to age myself now, but this was 1989. I found out they were feeding ground up cow bones back to cows and sheep, because it was a purely reductionist approach at getting back the last bits of protein that could possibly be on a carcass, using a system called mechanically reclaimed protein. And so
they're looking at doing this again, like feeding livestock to other livestock. I mean, they're stopping short of doing same species, but they're going to feed the cows to the pigs and the pigs to the chickens, and so it's madness. It's so wrong
in every way that you can think of. It's a pure kind of end point of reductionism, an extractive nature of thinking. There's nothing holistic about that at all. when I found out about that, I stopped eating meat on that premise. I never, throughout my time of being a vegetarian, I never sort of said people shouldn't eat animals, but I said we shouldn't eat animals the way that we're doing it. That was always my stance. And back then in 1989 in London, I mean, you could eat vegetarian food at the Hare Krishna place in Soho Square, and there was a very expensive restaurant called The Gate in Hammersmith. Other than that, it was like picking the bits out, that was your option at restaurants. It was pretty dire. It was chips and salad again kind of thing.
I have to say, genuinely, I do have a lot of respect for the vegetarians of like the early 90s, because I mean, yeah, that must have been grim. I've only been vegan since it's been pretty bloody easy to be vegan. Frankly, I didn't like 2020 when it was fully
a lot of good investment in that world, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've never not been able to eat Burger King, right? Like
right. Oh my God, wow. So yeah, I ate that way for 25 years, and this maybe slightly contentious point for your side, I hate using that word, but is that after 25 years, I just really wasn't very well. I'd become pretty allergic to a lot of the things I was eating, mainly soy. I developed a pretty solid intolerance to soy and a lot of the other beans and legumes and things that I was eating a lot of, which manifest as terrible brain fog. I was exercising an awful lot. I was, at the time, going for my sort of second black belt level at different martial art, and I wasn't recovering very well.
I didn't realize who I was messing with.
I wasn't recovering very well, and I was starting to develop some autoimmune conditions. And I was talking to a lot of friends who had been long-term vegetarians, one of whom had started eating a paleo-style diet, so had included meat and replaced the traditional then Linda McCartney burgers and sauce mix and all the other kind of bits and pieces with grass-fed meat, and cut out the grains and cut out the legumes, cut out the sugars, and felt a whole lot better. So I told myself I'd try it as an experiment, and the results were quite profound in terms of how I felt. I literally felt like my brain was rebooting. And in hindsight, I wonder if I'm one of those people that was a poor converter of omega-3 fatty acids from the plant-based versions. It could be to do with methylation. It could be to do with, I could have the, I think it's APOC01 gene to do with, it could be non-hemine conversion. There's all sorts of genes that affect how we upcycle. Vitamin A is the vitamin A conversion. It could be all sorts of things. But the result of it was I felt like a different person from putting a bit of meat into my diet. That started me on a path of learning. I was like, okay, I haven't eaten meat for 25 years. I stopped because of environmental, ethical, and health reasons. But one of those things I can now tick off. How do the other two stack up? And that led me into discovering regenerative agriculture, and to basically co-founding the Ethical Butcher. But yeah, it was.
Can we hover on the health before we go on? Because again, I listened to you talking about the Ethical Butcher a couple of times, and I mean, I really do think that a lot in this conversation, in its many forms as it may be replicated in conference rooms and so on, comes down to whether somebody is like kind of serious and sincere in their approach to this kind of stuff, as my read is that you are through and through, versus, like I say, like people kind of cynically misappropriating the vibe of regenerative and kind of applying that more broadly. But so I think, and I'm actually really interested to talk to you about kind of some of the challenges that you had with sourcing when you were looking into the Ethical Butcher and how to set it up and everything. But just on the health stuff first. So, I mean, it sounds like, first of all, I understand that you're just kind of recounting your
it's anecdote,
your experience, right? Okay. So you understand that that's not the basis for like making any broader claims about like health in general about it.
We have very individual epigenetics, genetics. We convert things at different rates. We have different nutritional requirements. And it's really interesting is that there's a fantastic book by a guy called Fred Provenza called Nourishment, where I think he looks at how humans and animals, when given choice, know how to eat biologically correct things to heal them. And there was an incredible experiment done, which would be totally illegal now, done on in Canada. It was a long time ago. I think it was sort of in the 1920s, done on an orphanage where these orphans were given the choice of what they wanted to eat out of 34 different foods. And the foods ranged from grains to fruit to organ meat to muscle meat to dairy, ferments, everything. And these children, who are not much bigger than toddlers, were monitored over quite a long period of time. And they basically self-medicated, and they ate a hugely varied diet because no one was telling them that's delicious and that's you need to eat that before you can eat that. They were given free rein. And these kids turned out to be taller, smarter than their peers, than average. And this experiment proved what has been known by good farmers, is that animals will, sheep, for example, they will eat the plants that they know their body needs. We are all different. Humans are different. Animals are different. Of course, I know people who are thriving after decades of strict veganism. There are people who even seem to manage eating only fruits, and I don't quite know how that's possible, but they do. There are also people who are doing incredibly well, who've cured all sorts of diseases on a strict carnivore diet, which is, very extreme. Most people, the vast majority of this world eats some form of omnivorous diet, but we are all different. I think it takes quite a lot of personal experimentation to find what's optimal for you. I think a lot of people confuse anecdote with data. So it's all very well me saying I was vegetarian, I didn't feel great, I ate meat, I felt better, therefore everybody should do that. That's nonsense. That's total bullshit. Or therefore use that as an arguing point to argue that we should do it. It's a bit like, I think what you were kind of alluding to is the kind of people who go, oh, but there have been studies that prove beef can be carbon negative in exceptional circumstances, and then they go and then they're going to Aldi to buy steaks, right, as a way of justifying eating meat. It's not the same. It's not.
Yeah. I sense that there's like a few health points that we could find some disagreement on.
Sure.
On the thing about well, first of all, I don't think that, I'm certainly not advocating for an all fruit diet, and I don't think that you're advocating for an all meat diet, just to, so that we're both kind of saying that. On the thing about kind of intuitive eating and healing themselves and so on, I mean, there are an awful lot of people who have access to whatever food that they want and become massively obese. So I wouldn't rely on that too heavily as a heuristic, because sometimes you want to go and eat that cake and that donut.
Yeah, but what the difference is, the experiment that I'm talking about with whole foods.
Right.
Any processed food. So one of the things I learned during my food degree, we went into a lab to learn how to make things like Doritos. And we were taught how food companies know how to, in nature, you won't find a food in nature that is high in sugar, high in salt, and high in fat. There is nothing that tastes like a Dorito in nature, for example, and the problem with ultra processed foods is that they're triggering different reward centers of the brain. Salt is incredibly valuable to us. Fats are essential to our life. You start triggering all those things at the same time, and sugar is a great reward. I think particularly for people with a Northern European heritage, we would have had very limited access to sugar. We might have had a few berries a few times of the year, but sugar might have meant survival for our ancestors. The people who can get fat in the summer were the ones who lived through the winter when there wasn't much food around. When you make an ultra processed food and you combine high levels of sugar, fat, and salt in the same food, your brain just goes crazy. All the dopamine's kicking off, and it just tells you you want to eat more of it. So when we're comparing sort of overeating, when those sort of foods are available versus natural whole foods, be they animal-based or plant-based, it's just not the same. The technology is working on our psychology in harder ways than we probably ever realized.
Okay, well, the ultra-processed food thing is triggering for me because that is a pet topic of mine, and I think that actually I can detect something going on in what you're saying. There's the ultra-processed foods category, which is category 4 Nova foods, as defined in the Nova classification system. But I think that what you are mainly talking about, what you seem to be talking about, is HFSS foods, which is high fat, salt, sugar foods, and they are not necessarily going to be the same thing.
Right. Okay. No. Thanks for that clarification. Yeah. Ultra processed is a term that it's too catch-all to have meaning. I used it flippantly there, and I appreciate that clarification, and I agree with you. Yeah. So thanks for that.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, because I mean, there's loads of like I said, this is a particular hobby horse of mine, so forgive me.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Yeah. No, go.
There's loads of course, like perfectly unprocessed things which one could eat that are deadly, right? And you can find mushrooms and berries that would be totally unprocessed that are going to kill you if you eat them. And then likewise, there's lots of things that are going to fall in the ultra-processed category that are like super health foods, basically. Protein powder is going to count as ultra-processed, right? I like that Joe Rogan always talks about ultra-processed, and he has AG1 as his sponsorship, right? Stuff like that is ultra-processed food, right? Now, it's not necessarily unhealthy, and that's my point. And this comes into play especially with maybe we'll find some interesting ground on plant-based meat alternatives, which are, I mean, the meat lobbies
against that, wasn't there, recently?
Right. Well, the meat lobbies have really done a hard work, and this is very much out in the open. There was the Centre for Consumer Freedom sponsoring the Super Bowl ads and all this. This was like 5 years ago, so it's been out in the open for a long time that they have been making this association of plant-based meats and ultra-processed. And so this idea that's kind of now in the zeitgeist that ultra-processed foods are unhealthy and maybe plant-based meats are ultra-processed foods has been very deliberately planted there. And the interesting thing about that is that this is one case where, compared to meat from animals, plant-based meat is lower in calories, lower in fat, lower in saturated fat, and higher in fiber. So many ways that are going to be important to the people who have the most pressing health issues in terms of heart disease and so on. These are going to be healthier than the meat that they're replacing.
I know. I have seen that kickback. I remember seeing that. I don't remember it being as long as 5 years ago, but that whole kind of there was a sort of push to reclassify some of the plant-based meats, and also, I mean, what a fact that is used on incorrectly, and is the whole sort of chemical fear thing, of like naming chemicals and saying we should be afraid of them, when of course everything is made of chemicals, regardless of where it comes from and whether it's been in a factory or not. So there's a lot of propaganda gets thrown around on. I hate the term sides, but on both sides, I know where you're coming from.
Well, I agree with both your use of the term and your distaste towards it, because it is. I think it is helpful for us to be less kind of polarized. And like I say, I do think that the ground where people like me and people like you, if I can put it that way, agree is much more fertile, to use the agriculture analogies, than the areas where we disagree. And I think that even we spoke a bit about health. We spoke a bit. There's some other health things that we could touch on that I've written down. I don't really want to get into the. I've written down kind of like some environmental arguments against regenerative, but I don't really want to spend our time on that, to be honest. We could talk about ethics.
I'm happy to talk about regen if you know. I know you said you don't want to, but you know, I'm happy to kind of do.
That's true, actually. That is your main thing, so I don't want to cheat you out of.
You know, it's kind of what the world I'm working in.
That's
now.
fair. That's fair.
You know,
okay, well, why don't you talk a bit about it, and I can objectify. think it's expedient.
So, do you mind if I start with what I think might be the counter argument to regenerative grazing?
Yes, sure.
That I would assume is scale.
Well, okay, yeah. So, So I can start you off and kind of confirm that. Broadly, yes. My criticism is going to be, and this is the thing that I will say on regenerative. It is a very small minority of all the meat that actually, one can purchase today in the UK, and B, it is, yes, not scalable, such that if we were to eat exclusively regeneratively farmed meat, it would entail a large reduction in overall consumption.
Right. So I figured I have heard that said quite a lot, and to me, that argument comes from sticking within the paradigm within which we are producing food now, which is treating all crops as separate. So the reason I think scale is, I do agree that we will in general have to reduce the amount of meat we consume, because the vast amount of meat that we consume is in this country is chicken. And by far, it's such a small percentage of any chicken consumed in the UK that ever even sees the sky. And that's horrible and abhorrent. And, we consume 35 million chicken a week in the UK. It's become a very efficient, affordable way of producing protein. It uses agricultural waste products. It's actually created a dual purpose product in the soybean. So the soybean's pressed for oil, the seed meal has a value for animal feed, and it mostly goes to pork and poultry and some dairy. But we need to, the way that poultry is produced in the UK is wrong. Poultry has a role in upcycling spent grains. So chickens do very well. Chickens do much better than cattle on grains. They can eat. I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize about plant agriculture, about arable agriculture, is it produces an awful lot of waste products. You get an awful lot of husks, seeds, stalks, seed meals, even like brewing process creates a lot of waste. That waste, if not dealt with, if it could be, it can be composted, it can be fermented, it can be brewed into kind of compost and things, but when that process is anaerobic, it's going to be producing methane. I think a more efficient way of using that is upcycling it by feeding it to well-managed poultry. If chickens are eating the spent products, if nothing's being grown specifically to act as a poultry feed, and those chickens are on land which is lacking in nutrition, they can drastically increase the nutrient content of the soil if they're kept in a regenerative way. So and the same thing with cattle. If we were to take some very, very tired arable land and put a rotation of cows in there as a suckler herd, and do proper holistic plan grazing so that the land is getting recovery time. We're starting with a very diverse herbal lay to make a really complex sward. We're going to be putting carbon in the soil. That's great, and that can help revitalize arable land. But if we are purely looking at keeping cows on what is permanent pasture, clearly there's not enough of it. We would have to drastically reduce the amount of grazing animals that we're eating. If we completely change the way we think about food production, and we start mimicking nature, in that there are no monocrops in nature, there are no animal only crops in nature, there are no plant only crops in nature. Everything's holistic, everything's integrated. So if we start taking a sort of full rotational aspect to our food production, and we're putting animals into cycles with crops, we can drastically reduce chemical dependency. We can restore soil health, And I believe we can still keep producing meat from grazing animals at the same level that we are now. The issue with poultry would have to be resolved in that if people want to still keep eating as many chickens as they do, they need to be put onto the land within a rotational system like the cows. And that just requires huge amount of infrastructure and knowledge that doesn't currently exist. So scale is not possible the way we're doing things, but it's very possible if we rethink building ecosystems rather than farming things separately. Building agroforestry systems, planting trees across land, taking out hedges and putting in trees and shrubs, and putting in the grains in between, planting market gardens on the same land, putting animals into the same systems, and just integrating our agriculture. It could be so different.
Yeah, I think that is a specific vision that I would have far less disagreement with than certainly how we're doing it currently. I think, you know, when we get further down the line on the... Actually, we'll bracket the ethical thing for now and talk just about the environmental points that you just mentioned. So when you said we could consume meat from grazing animals at the same level as we are now, do you mean at the same level as animals that we have grazing?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
So it might still entail
I'm talking about the UK only. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not talking globally. That's too complicated.
But it could still entail an overall reduction in beef, for example.
It could, or we could keep consuming beef at the same level we are at the moment, or producing beef at the same level in the UK. We could do it in a way that has a completely different environmental impact. Because
not including the sort of feedlot stage.
The feedlots are making a presence in the UK, but it's relatively small compared to the US. Most beef in the UK is grass-fed and grain finished. So the animals will spend a large proportion, if not the majority of their life, eating grass. But the problem with that is that we're growing the grass like a crop. So most cows are eating ryegrass and clover. It's grown as a crop. It's very nitrogen hungry. So NPK is put onto the fields to make the grass grow. There's a big difference between grass-fed and pasture-fed. Huge difference, worlds apart. So you see cows in a field eating grass, and all the grass is one color and one level, and sheep will take it down like a billiard table. They're eating a crop. That's not an ecosystem. One of my colleagues calls it a green desert. And there's a really important distinction to be made there between what you see and you think is grass-fed and what I would term pasture-fed, where the cow is an integral part of a complex relationship, a complex ecosystem, which is encouraging more life. Otherwise, it's a different form of factory farming in many ways. And
one of the other differences that one could point to for grass-fed and pasture-fed, or pasture-raised, I guess would be the term, pasture-reared, something like that. You could be grass-fed in a shed, couldn't you?
In a shed, you can. Yeah, you can. And
you can bring grass inside. Lawnmowers exist.
Yeah, no, you can.
Right.
And actually, so yeah, that the whole term grass-fed.
So grass-fed doesn't necessarily mean reared on the pasture. Yeah.
Do you know the DEFRA definition is even fuzzier? Do you know about this? Do you know?
No, I don't.
So DEFRA produce food labelling guidelines for the UK. It's not guidelines; it's the legal structure of food labelling. And there's a line in there that says, "And the meat from an animal can be sold as grass-fed if the diet of the animal was predominantly grass."
Oh right, the 51% grass. Yeah.
So for that's the reason why organisations like Pasture for Life, they used to be called PFLA, but Pasture for Life formed, because they were just fed up there were people who really were trying to farm with nature and who had committed to not feeding grains to their animals for reasons of ethics, because when you take a cow off grass and you start feeding it grains, it stomach is not designed. Its digestive system is not supposed to be eating.
Yeah, I changed the pH levels and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, you know all that. And it changes the omega content of the fats and reduces a lot of their nutrients. So that's the reason pasture for life exists, because the legal definition set by the government is very, very misleading. But as you quite rightly said as well, a lot of dairy in this country is produced is absolute madness. So we have a great country for growing grass. I was up in Cumbria recently at a farm who is a proper pasture for life certified and organic, and is now studying. We did ecological outcome verification on the farm. They're converting to regenerative, and this dairy farmer up there was telling me, and the calves stay with the cows. There's no separation. It was about as good as you can get for dairy, and he lives in Cumbria where grass grows so well. It's like, it's the perfect climate for growing pasture. And yet the biggest dairy buyer in that area, Arla, they insist that farmers keep their cows in their sheds. They grow the grass on the fields. They cut the grass and bring it to the cows in the sheds. And then their diet is supplemented with these pellets, which contain, soy meal, vitamins, minerals, and whatever.
Why do they insist that they do that?
It's all about standardization. So it means that the milk has set amounts of protein and fats, and they can pull it all together, and it's all the same.
They want Arla milk to taste the same, regardless which farm it's come from.
But at what level of madness is that?
That is pretty mental, yeah.
We're treating these animals like the end part of a machine rather than living beings. And these animals don't have the ability to choose what they want to eat. It would be like forcing all of humanity to live on Huel,
right.
Something like that, or
that was going to be one of my suggestions to you, Glenn. Actually,
and it's just that separation from nature that I find very hard to get my head around. It's about control and profit and standardization, and that's everything that I find distasteful in food. I'm a foodie. I like to eat, and I like to find variances and differences and differences in quality. That and the environmental impact is green desert is a great way of putting it in terms of the biodiversity created by those systems.
Let me see what I can say. Okay, so. Yeah, like I said, I don't really want to argue against those kind of systems. My only point really is to point out that, it's a small amount of our meat, and to be fair, I do appreciate what you said about the pasture for life thing, because one of my ideas for a sort of productive outcome from this conversation was to explore some sort of label that or standard that does denote this means what you would hope
right. Sure. I know what you're saying. If you're going to do it, make sure you know what you're doing.
And I'll say as well, for context, people who might not know listening, Glen was a vegetarian for 25 years, and in starting the Ethical Butcher, from some of the interviews that you've given, I can tell that there were times when you were leaving money on the table because you weren't happy with you couldn't find animals that were treated to your standards, which is an honourable thing to have done. And I think that frankly, there is a good saying, look, people, to the extent that people are going to be eating meat, it should try and be the highest welfare and everything. And I mean, I guess that you ran into the problem of finding it's actually bloody difficult to find like genuinely high welfare. Your demand must have been outstripping your supply of that kind of high welfare.
It was, but it brought up so many other issues as well, in that we were buying whole carcass. So we were buying entire animals from farmers, and it brought up another problem that people don't realize exists, is that if you go to Smithfield Market, the main kind of meat market in London that supplies restaurants, butchers, catering, everyone. You can turn up there and say, I want to buy 200 kilos of fillet steak. And I forget what it is, but each animal only produces about 3 or 4 kilos of fillet steak.
Right.
So you can, it's a long, thin, lazy muscle that sits in the back that doesn't do much work, so it's very tender. And it's arguably the prime cut of a cow. You can go to Smithfield and they'll sell you 200 kilos of fillet steak. We get approached as the ethical butcher saying somebody wants 10 kilos of fillet steak, and we're like, well, that's 4 or 5 animals. What are we going to do? Unless you're willing to buy 1.5 tons of mincemeat, you can't have the kilos of fillet steak that you want, because this is what a whole animal looks like.
Yeah.
And without the economy of scale of being able to do that, it's very hard for people to get their idea around this sort of concept of carcass balance. And we were wanting to use every last bit. We were wanting to not leave, a single usable calorie unsold. So that was also a very difficult part of the business to communicate to the public. It's like, you want that, then you also need to eat some liver, you need to eat some mince, you need to eat some diced, some stewing steak, you need the tougher to cook bits. You can't just have your fillet, sirloin and ribeye.
Yeah, that's such an interesting. I mean, I've thought about this problem for the animal industry, right? There might be examples that people can think of. Maybe people will comment. I can't think of many other commodities that must be produced in certain ratios to other commodities. It's not like for every kilo of steel that you produce, you have to produce a kilo of gold or something like that. There's just no equivalent for other, right? And so,
well, it's a bit like soy is almost an example of that has created another problem. So a lot of soy, the majority of soy is made to produce oil, because soy oil is valued at what 2,000 or 3,000 pounds a ton or whatever it is, when it's pressed. But it leaves this waste product of soy meal, of which there are 5 times more, but it's only 1/5 of the value. So what do you do with soy meal? Arguably, factory farming was facilitated by soya oil production, and the waste product of soy oil production goes into factory farming. It's high in protein. It's still the meal, after it's been pressed for oil, still contains enough protein to make chickens grow like crazy and to make pigs grow like crazy. So the whole world, all of these systems are so interlinked and complex rather than complicated. They've become complex, and there's a big difference between complicated and complex, as I'm sure as a scientist you'll understand.
No, I've not heard that distinction before. What's the difference between complicated?
Okay, so something that's complicated would be a machine. Like you could take all the parts for a 747 and assemble it according to instructions, and you would have a fully working machine. Mm-hmm. Something that's complicated. So building an airplane is complicated. Something that's complex is where minor variations in inputs will have huge variations in outputs. So we're talking about complexity theory, where like an ecosystem, for example, where you've got
like a
so
butterfly
many
effect kind of thing.
Butterfly effect, but it basically, nature is complex, and a lot of human systems now have become complex because they've gone beyond being complicated. There are so many feedback loops, both positive and negative, that are having effects on outcomes that it becomes complex. And one of the problems we have of unraveling our food system is that it's complex, not complicated.
One of the things that will happen due to the thank you for that, by the way. That's an interesting. I did appreciate that. One of the things that will happen on the this kind of ratio problem that we're talking about, where you have to have 1.5 tons of mincemeat for every few kilos of fillet steak. Is it the case that the cheap cuts tend to get exported to poorer countries? Basically, that's what I've heard. It's the will happen a lot of the time. I mean, you may not know the answer to that.
I actually don't know the answer to that, to be honest. No.
Or it could also be the case that like there's a lot of like Argentinian fillet steaks in London, but there's very few British fillet steaks in Argentina, I bet, right? Like
yeah, that's
so maybe we're importing the good cuts and exporting them.
it is interesting. We were the whole kind of the other thing that comes into it. Since you mentioned Argentina there, if I could just sort of get into that idea of food miles for a minute, because it's something I see very badly used as an argument on, again, I hate the term, but both sides. For example, of people saying, oh, well, when people go, oh, the vegans are eating fruit that's been shipped around the world. It's like, well, actually, the shipping of a fruit around the world is so low impact compared to how that fruit was produced.
Oh, I know. It's lovely talking to a guy who used to be a vegetarian. You do know all the vegetarian argument. Yeah.
And conversely, you would be really shocked. So I read a sustainability report by a restaurant chain that I'm not going to name, but it was very good and very thorough. They serve a lot of red meat. They're known for steaks, and a lot of their steaks come from South America. I've probably just blown it, but a sustainability report identified that the meat that was coming from South America, the meat that was produced in South America was produced on rangeland, holistically grazed, about as good as it can get. The animals are as close to being wild animals as you can possibly have it on steppe grass, running around only eating grass for their entire lives, living as family units. It's about as good as it gets. So the environmental impact was incredibly low as far as the farm gate. Then all meat that we eat is aged for 28 days. So if an animal's killed for meat in the UK, it's put into the abattoir, it's in a temperature controlled, humidity controlled storage, and it ages for 28 days. That aging process requires some resources. It requires, energy to do that. The meat that was coming from South America was aged in transit. So it was put into shipping containers that were creating the right conditions for that meat to age. So that time was being spent just bringing it over from South America. There was a greater carbon impact from local distribution of that meat when the vans got smaller in the UK than there was in the production to the port, even though it was coming from Uruguay.
Wow.
So, it's just so complex, the whole thing. It's the banana argument, it's like, no, like if you grow organic bananas and you transport them from wherever bananas are growing organically, that's a pretty low impact product. Even if you're eating it in Northern Europe, it's not the economy of scale of shipping en masse is actually pretty good. It's when you break it down to small vans and cars. And I've always said, if someone gets in their car to drive half an hour to a farmer's market, they've negated all the benefit of the method of production they've gained from having. So order it online.
Yeah, there you go.
Where the economies of scale work better in terms of carbon impact.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, I agree with your point that food miles is largely kind of a distraction. It's sort of like a meme thing that people care about with respect to food sustainability. Food miles is a very catchy term, and plastic packaging is the other thing that people get very obsessed about with food.
Yeah, true.
There's so much, like you say, before it leaves the farm gate, right? It's almost all of the impact.
That's what matters.
Yeah.
That's what matters is before anything leaves the farm gate. Method of production is what we should be dealing with way before we shouldn't not worry about packaging and transport, but we've got to worry about method of production first. Yeah. And that's for everything. That's crops, animals, dairy, fish, the lot. That's the most important. That's the factor that's affecting our planet the most.
Okay, well, we're at the hour, but I think we can both go a little bit longer.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
We must talk a little bit about the ethical side, and I don't think it will be. Well, we'll see. And I want to drive towards some outcomes that we can agree on as well. I mentioned the thing about having a proper label for regenerative, such that a consumer will have a reliable way of knowing that this is produced in such a way that adheres to these specific standards. And one thing that I'll kind of bracket on that, we were discussing Pasture for Life and their certification. I don't know much about that organization or their certification, so I nothing about that in particular. But I will say I have some concerns about private certification schemes in general, and their animal welfare. The RSP, you will have seen all the drama around the RSPCA certification scheme last year. Yeah. One of the problems there is like perverse incentives for the certifier also being paid to do the certifying.
So marking your own homework.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you're a chicken farm and I'm the RSPCA and you're paying me $10,000 a year or whatever it is for the badge, where's my incentive to ever come and tell you that you're doing it wrong and you can't have the badge anymore? You're going to stop paying me $10,000 a year, aren't you? So there's that component to it, and then there's also, I think the other thing is kind of like and neither of these are criticisms of trying to do regenerative or trying to do high welfare per se. They're just kind of in the execution, and in the execution of private labels in particular. So that's the first point about the perverse incentives. And then the second point is it produces this kind of lopsided perception of the overall products in the market. Because when you say it's optional to have it's optional to tell us how high the animal welfare was, well, I'm probably only going to tell you if it was pretty high welfare, right? I'm not going to probably put factory farmed if I don't have to. And so as a result of that, I mean, I often say you can imagine a world where it's optional to put nutritional information on your products. And cake manufacturers all go, great, right? I'm not going to put my nutritional information. Now, you might have some cake manufacturers that are like, we're the healthy, raisin cakes or whatever boring stuff, right? Now they're going to say, well, we are going to put our nutritional information because ours is actually quite good nutrition. So here we go. We got the green label or whatever it is. Now, when you walk down the cake aisle in the supermarket, you are only going to see the green labels. You're not seeing any of the optional red labels. And so you walk out thinking cakes are pretty healthy. So there's that kind of like skewing of the entire perception where it's easy for people to imagine that animal welfare is high in general if they only ever see the high welfare tick and never the factory farmed cross, right? So I think that for that reason, like mandatory labeling on all products, whether it's good news or not, is really important, and to be done in a consistent way. That is, there's the stuff that's proposed in DEFRA at the moment is very feasible, and it works like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 grading system, because it needs to be consistent as well. That's the other thing. When you have a mishmash of sort of private certifications, they all look kind of similar. They've got like the British flag and something else going on. Like they all mean kind of similar things, but they're a bit different. So you want something that's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the conditions. Everyone has to have a label, regardless if it's good news or bad news. And well, I will say as well, in that condition, that's good news for the people with your view on it, because that's good news for the people for the high welfare ones, right?
It's good news for everyone. I mean, it would just raise the bar all round. That's super interesting.
It's bad news for the factory farms.
yeah, I hadn't really considered that way, but we want factory farms to have bad news. I
absolutely,
the thing I'd also like to include in factory farming is industrial arable, because that is also factory farming. If you've got a field of wheat that's sprayed off with a desiccant before harvest, like glyphosate to kill the plant because you've got a harvest window coming up, you've effectively created a desert for that period of time. That is also factory farming. Factory farming to me is anything that is deleterious to the environment or the thing being grown. I use the term across animal and arable, even though it's mostly applied to animal. I completely support your position on that.
I might push back a little bit on the dilution of factory. I mean, I'm happy to say industrial crop farming or something like that. To me, factory farming means dungeons full of pigs. Like, do you know what I mean?
Okay, all right. I'll give you that one. Fair enough. All right. It's more the sort of the principle I was getting at.
There is surely practices that are done with monocropping and stuff like that are not environmentally optimal. I mean, as with animal production, it is an economic question at the end of the day, isn't it? I mean, people imagine when they think about animal farming that, and again, it's an interesting thing because the majority of farms are probably high welfare, but the majority of animals are crammed into the few farms that are factory farms, and that's why they're low welfare. So it might, it could be the case that I'm making up numbers here, but let's say that over 80% of the farms in the UK are, small kind of back garden pigs or whatever. But because there's so few animals in each one, like 99%, 90% plus of the meat.
Incredibly generous with your numbers there. But yeah,
but do you see what I mean? Like the number of farms is not necessarily the relevant. Yeah.
Yeah. It's volume and percentages that matter more.
Right.
Yeah, I hadn't really considered the idea of kind of, I don't know if there's a term for it, that sort of upwashing that you described as like, where you spot something and apply it to the whole genre. But I remember I was working for a while on a campaign called Clear Food Labeling, and one of the founders of that campaign, who is a farmer, brilliant lady called Fidelity, kind of made the point to me once. She's like, why should we pay more for food that has more chemicals on it? It's like, it should be the other way around, that farmers should have to pay fines for using chemicals on their food, because it means they're not farming properly. So if farmers had to pay fines to use fertilizer, antibiotics, and I'm going to use this across the board of animal and arable, but like if you had to pay a fine every time you use an insecticide or you needed to buy external fertilizer, or you needed to even worm your cattle or use an antibiotic because you've got mastitis in your dairy herd or whatever it is, if you were fined every time you had to do that and you weren't just relying on the input to solve a problem, our food could potentially get skewed upside down, so that the more natural produced, healthier food, healthier for us, healthier for the environment, healthier for the animals, became cheaper than the industrially produced stuff that was reliant on inputs. And it would push farmers to find new methods of production that didn't involve chemicals. It was a really interesting idea.
I think a problem that we have is it just, I do like what you're saying about imposing some sort of fine, or there could be other kind of incentive systems that properly incentivize the right way of doing it, basically. We need to come up with ways to overcome the problem that, I'm sorry, but factory farming is just the cheapest way of producing chicken. Do you know what I mean? Like I've seen that the chicken, I've heard you talking about the chicken that you're doing through the ethical butcher, and it is like considerably more expensive than chicken that you'd get in the supermarket, as well it should be.
Yeah.
But most consumers are not gonna do that, right?
People can't pay £30 for a chicken, and it's pretty. This is again down to how much of our income we spend on food, and it's incredibly low compared to our grandparents or great grandparents. There was a time, and I may have my figures completely wrong, but there was a time going back 100 years ago where I think 50% of people's income was spent on food, and now it's is it 10% or 8%?
Interesting.
Because we have so many other things vying for our money. We have holidays, we have iPhones, we have Netflix subscriptions, we have gym memberships, we have fast fashion, we have all these other things that are sort of taking up our disposable income, and we're spending a such lower proportion of our net earnings on food compared to 100 years ago. Like it's down by 5 times. So
it's interesting. I mean, sorry, go ahead, finish the thought.
So it is completely possible now, if we were to even, if it's important to you, I spend very little money on clothes and all, those sort of trappings of life, and I live quite modestly. I spend an awful lot of money on food because that's important to me. It's important to me knowing what it's done to the world and what it's going to do to me. But I accept that not everybody's me, and people don't care, they don't understand. And a lot of people aren't as fortunate as me to even be able to make that choice. It's a very, very difficult problem. But there's a lot of government money that's, I think, being spent in the wrong direction, and that could help produce better quality food.
Well, they've sort of paused, I guess, the sustainable farming incentive, which is going to be maybe coming back in. I mean, I think that was largely a better system than what it replaced.
The countryside stewardship scheme or whatever it was. Was it?
The sustainable farming. Yeah, I think that was part.
I get left a bit cold on that government stuff. I have to be honest.
Okay, fair. Yeah, the sustainable farming. I mean, it was basically the what was it? ELMS, Environmental Land Management Scheme.
ELMS,
Yeah, that's what. Yeah. So that was the thing that was to replace the EU payments. But who knows? I mean, who knows what will happen with all that now, right? They're talking about closer alignment again. So we'll see. What another thing that I enjoyed sort of discovering about you, Glenn, and one nasty side effect of watching your videos, I came to quite like you before I had to debate you. So it's you're a likeable chap. I could tell that you did give up vegetarianism under some duress. Basically, you didn't really want to do that, and you spoke about it was difficult change of identity and all this kind of thing, and had pretty much as proactive a way of doing that as somebody could in terms of trying to source as ethically as possible, taking very seriously getting meat from ethical sources and stuff like that. And I think, as I said to you in a comment, I do, and I would defend this, I am the other side of the line in terms of killing the animal, but prior to that, I think there is a world of difference morally in factory farming versus regenerative versus high welfare, right? Mm-hmm. And I really do think that is a huge difference worth considering. I suppose from a practical perspective, my concern would be that we do live by kind of heuristics and have rules that we follow in our lives, and a lot of the time it's kind of easy to subscribe to a pre-existing set of rules, such as veganism, right? There's this pre-existing set of rules called vegan. It means that you don't have any animal products under any circumstances. Doesn't matter if it was high welfare, doesn't matter if it's regenerative, whatever, right? You're just strictly not having any animal products. And as a result of following that heuristic, I am never in a position where I'm accidentally, or maybe like in a lapse of willpower or whatever, gonna have some factory farmed products. Is that something that you've struggled with? I imagine that once you're like, I'm not a vegetarian anymore, you are sometimes going around other people's houses or eating out, and you can't always guarantee.
No, that I see where you're getting at, and I accept that. I accept that sort of when I kind of gave up that label and that identity, if you like, as being a vegetarian, and I had to concede that there would be occasions where my stance, my current ethical stance, would not always be able to be honoured. But in the examples that you set out, I mean, if I go out for a meal, I have a choice of what I order off the menu, but going to a friend's house, you don't. But I mean, without wanting to sound too middle class, most of my friends who would invite me over for dinner are relatively clued up on sourcing ingredients. I've got a kind of circle of friends who are chefs and foodies and things who do source their things very well. But the thing that I think came to me as a realization is that it's the macro, not the micro, in terms of impact that's important. And I include in that animal lives, environmental impact, as much as anything. And I could see how some people could say this is a cop-out, but I do fully believe that it is possible to eat a quote-unquote strictly vegan diet, in that you don't physically consume any animal products at all, that does more environmental health than a very conscious regenerative omnivorous diet. If you want to take the two absolute extremes, of course, very few people.
More environmental harm, I think you meant to say.
Yeah, right? More environmental harm. Yeah, very few people exist in either of those extremes. There are very few vegans who only eat junk food, who aren't eating any whole foods, that have been, the odd organic thing here and there that's been well produced and well thought out. There are, likewise, there are very few people who only eat regeneratively farmed, biodynamic organic food, and I'm included in that. No, not everything I eat is that perfect. I would say that actually the majority of the food that I buy is, because I get it from the farmer's market, but I'll get the odd Pret sandwich when I'm out. I'm not perfect, you know. I know it's not come from my standards, but there is a grey area in between all of that, which is difficult to navigate, and I hate the sort of black and white that people put onto that grey area, because I do firmly believe that that it is possible to eat an ill-considered vegan diet that is that does as much more environmental damage than a well-considered regenerative diet. So take the extremes away and let's kind of just do our best in the middle.
I mean, yeah, you could probably design a vegan diet that would have a worse impact than some omnivorous diet. I would agree to that. But just to stick on the ethical point, I agree that there are things that we can do which are kind of more important. To be honest, in my view, there are things that we can do which are much more important to reducing animal suffering than whatever you're eating personally, but that's kind of a different topic. It does seem that it's a alluring kind of story for future ex-vegans, right? To think about the cases where there could be, you know, sort of the perfectly ethical meat and all this sort of thing. But it's interesting that, I mean, you are eating factory farmed meat.
But I what? Sorry.
You are eating meat from factory farms.
Yeah, it's a very small proportion, but if I go to somebody's house, I'm not going to say, how did this live? You know, I'll eat a meal that's provided for me. So on those odd rare occasions where I might have to get a sandwich on a train or something, yeah. I'm not perfect. I know I'm not.
And no, I mean, yeah, none of us are. I mean, how does that feel? How did that feel? How has that felt to be? Because I mean, like I said, I can tell that you stopped being vegetarian with some hesitation and with a real sense of like, we can do this the right way and everything.
It is honestly a very, very small portion of my diet, because I'm very fortunate to live in northwest London, very close to a farmer's market that produces the highest quality grass-fed regenerative meats coming from farmers that I know and I've spoken to, and I sometimes will buy box of meat online. I can get pastured eggs, and all of my vegetables are biodynamic and organic and come from the farmer's market. And I spend a ridiculous proportion of my income on food to feed a family of four. I work from home where I'm sitting now, so my 3 meals a day are generally in the room that I'm sitting in now from ingredients that I bought from the market. I make my own bread. I make my, I do the odd ferment, and I really do try. So if I end up buying a Pret sandwich in a train station because I've forgotten to eat, I don't beat myself up about it.
Yeah, and frankly, I mean, maybe yes. Listen, I can tell that you are going to lots of lengths to minimize that impact as much as possible, and it is interesting to hear about the limitations of that and like the ways in which that might not be plausible for everyone to do, because not, you're a well-off chap and not everybody could afford to spend so much on their meat and stuff like that. So, again, I do think that is far better than just consuming animal products willy-nilly. But I think, in practice, there will be people who, like I say, look towards that and even see that as a viable kind of route, but then end up like ultimately kind of, compromising values and kind of rational. But again, I'm not looking to drag you over the coals for that. And I think that, I would just make the point that it is, if you are not following one of the heuristics called vegan, well, the heuristic called vegan, it is very, very difficult in practice to ensure that you're not supporting factory farms.
Yes.
Though not impossible, certainly not impossible.
I guess I also erroneously slightly justify it because my current job position is trying to change the food system from within by measuring ecological impact on farms, through EOV, which is the savory method of measuring the state of the land. I'm working in the field of trying to.
But this is my job as well, so you can't say that to me. Listen.
We're both coming from looking at different angles, but
yes, and it's worth saying for the audience as well that we both do work in the field, so we both have like all sorts of conflicts of interest and stuff going into this conversation, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But listen, I do think that. What was the other? Oh yes, well, the other thing that I was hoping we would agree on, which I think that you would agree on, is kind of a subset of the welfare labelling overall, is restricting low welfare imports, because we have this issue at the moment where you've got British farms having to meet certain set of standards, and then you can get undercut by low welfare meat from wherever, right?
Yeah, no. Again, this comes down to government and economics, and I completely agree with you. There's no, we should not be allowing food in that wouldn't meet the standards that it was produced in the UK. Absolutely not.
Yeah,
I completely agree with you.
Nice. Okay, well, I'm really pleased that we're agreeing on those points. And just before I wrap up, you don't work for the Ethical Butcher anymore?
No, I haven't done for a couple of years because of what I do. I'm a creative. I'm a photographer, filmmaker, copywriter. So I got to a point where with the Ethical Butcher, I'd filmed a load of recipes. I visited every farm that we were supplying from and made a film about it, and I'd photographed every cut of meat we could think of. And I ended up just sort of looking for a new challenge to be involved in. I ended up sort of almost running out of things to do within my job title there.
And do you still have any involvement with them? I still
have equity, but they're actually doing very well. I keep in touch. The business is thriving. They've really done well by, and you probably find this quite interesting. Their main growth market is wholesale to restaurants. So restaurant groups are working with them a lot now. Some really fantastic, very forward-thinking groups like Oaxaca, for example, are working with Ethical Butcher, and so I think the kind of whole hospitality industry is waking up to the implications of 2030 and all the different scopes of carbon, for example, and looking at that, and wanting also to create a point of differentiation, because that's the one thing in hospitality you really do, unless you're going to a place that's known for its sourcing, it's as cheap as it can be.
Yeah. Okay. And how are there like specific standards or guidelines that Ethical Butcher meet is to, this is the criteria?
Yeah.
Kind of thing?
So this is still a very difficult area. The very minimal standard with Ethical Butcher is pasture for life. It's pasture for life certified. So the animals.
Does that only apply to ruminants?
It does only apply to ruminants. Yeah, well spotted. As for the monogastric, so pigs and chickens, when I was there, we were working with farmers to develop a soy-free feed, so that we said it's not acceptable for, even if the animals are outdoors, for them to be fed soy, because that has implications in other parts of the world. It's also unnecessary. There are crops that can be grown in the UK as cover crops, which is literally in between annual cycles. You put a crop down to protect the soil and to add nitrogen usually. So there's a lot of things like different types of field beans that can grow, that can benefit the soil in between, and that can be produced, that can be used as chicken feed. The general concept was that every animal that was sold as meat should have had a net benefit to the environment it was in some way.
That's difficult to. Okay. Yeah. To the environment it was in. That's a sneaky clause. Not to the environment overall, right? Because it's a subset of regenerative, which is actually like carbon negative, right? Or emissions negative, let's say.
It's a very hard thing to definitively measure, but if you're looking at, we could go into the whole kind of carbon thing, but and carbon and methane, but the biggest concern with grazing animals seems to be methane. People are concerned about methane.
Mm-hmm.
And if we've got a couple of minutes and maybe sort of dig into that, if an animal is on pasture and it's eating grasses and it's eating pasture, it's eating cellulose-based plants, the fermentation by the bacteria in its gut as a byproduct is creating some methane, which the cow is burping out. Now, methane is a carbon-based molecule. It's CH4, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the methane. Every atom of carbon that the cow burps was in the atmosphere. It was taken up by a plant in photosynthesis, turned into cellulose, eaten by the cow. In an ideal world, if you don't introduce any more animals into that system, that is a self-regulating cycle that should not create a net gain in atmospheric methane, because it's a biogenic cycle. So you cannot produce more methane or more carbon. Methane is a short-acting gas. In 10 years, ultraviolet light breaks it back down into carbon dioxide and water. The carbon dioxide is reabsorbed. There has been, since 1970, there has been a small decline globally in cattle numbers worldwide, and yet methane is going up. So either there are other sources of methane, like rice paddy farming produces a lot of methane through flooding the fields, which is a form of weed control. There's a lot of, global warming is creating a lot of methane being reduced from permafrost, which is previously trapped in the soil. A cow in a purely pasture-based system with no inputs at the farm gate should be carbon neutral, because you're not introducing any new carbon that hasn't come from the atmosphere in the first place.
Okay, I'll resist using. I'll resist going after. I do have a hard stop on the half hour, unfortunately. I have read a position that the 12-year breakdown around methane makes it a more compelling short-term target for trying to mitigate climate change, for example, because it's like, this is something that you could radically affect in 10 years time, right? Or in 12 years time.
Yeah, we could. If we had no more cows, we could. But what would be the knock-on effect of doing that on our food systems? Because if we then start using more fossil fuels, which aren't a 12-year cycle, they're a 120 million year cycle.
Okay. Well,
then you're introducing new carbon into the system.
Yeah, I wish we had longer to talk, but unfortunately not.
We'll do it again, Chris. This has been fun.
Yes, we should. And, as I hoped that we would, we have found many areas of agreement after our, somewhat theatrical disagreements on LinkedIn, so I'm glad for that. And I'm glad as well that will have hopefully generated some interest for people to watch this conversation and see the areas where we do agree. We are in agreement that I think we could probably say in developed countries in general, we need to be reducing overall meat consumption. We're in agreement that factory farming of animals is a bad thing, and that agroecological and high welfare systems are far preferable, and that there should be some sort of mandatory welfare labeling to incentivize doing it the right way, basically. I think we probably have some other areas of disagreement that we could get onto, but I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Hey,
thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for the conversation, Glenn. I really, really do appreciate you doing this, because it's being a little bit boisterous on LinkedIn. So props to you for stepping in the room.
Well, I look forward to seeing comments from either side and getting.
Oh yeah, I'm sure we'll both get slaughtered, but we're up for it. All right.
Cheers.
Take care, Glenn.